for Walker because he missed yesterday. Oops. Okay, so conservation of biodiversity. There is a lot of diverse life on Earth, and we want to keep that in place, right? There are some areas of the world that are more diverse than others. Where would you expect to see higher biodiversity on Earth? Rainforests. What's so great about rainforests causes so much biodiversity? What are the environmental characteristics? Sun and water. It's warm, there's water, there's a lot of nutrients for our primary producers, and more primary producers leads to more stuff that can base the ecosystem off of those primary producers. So rainforests, we'll see a lot on islands, a lot during or in the equator. All of these areas that have really high levels of biodiversity, we can classify as biodiversity hotspots. These are areas with a lot of endemic species. So you might have heard endemic species before. What that means is this is a species that is unique to this area. So something that's endemic to Central America is something you wouldn't find anywhere else. It is an endemic species. So these areas, these biodiversity hotspots, are really important to conserve in terms of keeping biodiversity high on Earth because of all of those endemic species. So we can look at those primary producers and get an idea of where these hotspots are. It's a good way to start and figure out what the highest diversity areas are. So looking at this, we can see that indeed it is around the equator that we see a lot of diverse plant life, vascular plants. And like I said, if you have a lot of diverse plants, it's going to support a diverse ecosystem. It's going to be that first rung of your trophic levels, and it's going to support a lot of life on top of that. We have hotspots in the United States. We can look at it in a couple different ways. There are areas where you have a lot of at-risk fish and mussel species, and if there are a lot of species at risk, it means that there's probably a lot of species there to start with. So if we look at areas here, what kind of regions of the US do we expect to be hotspots in terms of biodiversity? Yeah, the South, Central, this area of the United States has quite a bit of biodiversity. What is not on this map that you expect to have a lot of biodiversity? If we're looking at this, it looks like all of the diversity on the US is centered on the eastern coast, but is that the only place in the US with diverse life? Where else would you expect diversity? West Coast, yeah. Maybe even Hawaii too. So the West Coast does have a lot of biodiversity, but they're not as at risk, or at least they weren't when that map was made. I don't have a date on it. They're probably more at risk now in California than they have been in the past, just because of climate change and other pressures that are being put on those organisms. But you do have a lot of biodiversity in California and Hawaii and some of the Southwest as well. So when we think about biodiversity in these hotspots, we expect to see it along the equator. We expect to see it on islands, but you can kind of think of land areas as islands in a sort of metaphorical sense if they're separated by mountains or deserts. And so this area here is bounded by the Appalachian Mountains. And over here we have deserts and we have the Rocky Mountains that is separating off that area. And so having that geographical separation, that it allows allopatric speciation to occur. And so you can have all of these different organisms that develop in this area and evolve in this area that are specific to those selective pressures. It's kind of the same idea as your island biogeography, areas that are, actually we'll get to that with conservation, skipping ahead. Okay, so in terms of why this is important, why biodiversity even matters, there are a lot of values that we can put on biodiversity. Some of those are human interactions, things that we care about, like sources of medicine, things that we can eat, things for recreational value. Going to pretty places is very enjoyable and we like doing that. But there's also inherent value that's important to think about too. So what would inherent value be for an organism? What is inherent? Okay, so it does sound like inherit, but that would be more for the wild genes. So that is important. That is an important value of biodiversity. We want to have that genetic diversity so that they could pass on different genes in case of environmental change. But inherent value means that it has value intrinsically, just to itself. It doesn't matter what our relationship is to this biodiversity as humans, it has value just within itself for the sake of existing. You don't only matter to me because of your relationship to me, you matter because you just matter. That's the inherent value. We also want to make sure that our ecosystems are healthy and stable. So every organism has a niche, has a role to play in their environment. And if you get rid of those, you can cause all of those trophic cascades that we saw a couple of units ago. And so it's important to keep biodiversity high in order to make our ecosystem stable and healthy as well. All right, so as our environments change, we saw that species and populations can evolve. They can also change in their distribution. So part of a change in a population is where would you find it? And so why would environmental changes cause a change in species distribution? Yeah, if your habitat changes, it might not have everything that you need to survive anymore. It might not fall within your fundamental niche anymore with those abiotic factors that you need within this certain zone. And so if we know where things lived in the past and we know what conditions are suitable for different organisms, we can make predictions about how that will change in the future as well. And so looking at future predictions of these factors, we can make predictions about the distribution of organisms, if they're going to gain habitat range, if they're going to lose habitat range. Why would we want to predict these kind of things? Why do we care where these trees might live 100 years from now? Do we care? Seems like we do. A lot of scientists study it. What can we use this information for? What was the title of this set of notes?
Conservation.
Conservation. What's conservation? Conserving, keeping things around, right? Keeping them. So if we want to predict where things are, if we want to keep these things around, we need to know what's the potential area that they could even live in. If their range completely disappears, then we need to take action. We need to make some changes in order to preserve and conserve these organisms. So it helps with our management strategies to know what things have done in the past and what pressures have caused them to move and where do we think these things will change in the future. So some species are more able to move than others. They'll have an easier time doing that, and some are going to be blocked by human obstacles. So say you have a forest and then you put a bunch of farmland between where that forest is now and its future potential geographic range. If there's 100 miles of agricultural flatland in between, it's not going to be able to do the slow creep to get to its next predicted geographic distribution, and then it might just stop existing. So making corridors, making connections between these habitats in their current and future distributions is important in allowing those organisms and those populations to still continue on. So we've looked at pollen proxies over the last 12 to 18,000 years ago, and we can see this movement over time as a result of past climate change. So it used to be that most of Canada and the northern United States was covered in an ice sheet. Obviously, if there's an ice sheet in the way, trees aren't going to have a great time growing there. And so the geographic range was pretty limited for these tree species. And as the temperatures rose, as the ice sheet retreated, you saw the geographic range of these tree species change. So these pollen proxies are found in the bottoms of lakes, old lakes. When these glaciers retreated, they left behind water and they left behind sediment down at the bottom. And sediment is really important in forming these fossilized layers and preserving this kind of information. So we can look back in geologic history and make these kind of studies. All right, so two species that we know their current distribution of are the red pine and the loblolly pine. They're two different pine species. Loblollies are ones that you'll see all over the place down here. And so they made predictions about where these pine trees are going to be distributed in 2100. So how are things looking for a red pine?
Good.
Good for the red pine?
Oh, no, wrong.
Depends on the existential dread that the red pine has. If they're just not having a great day, they're like, great, I won't exist anymore. But it's looking like their geographic distribution is pretty much being eliminated. What isn't shown on this map that might change that? Canada. It's possible that they're just moving up into Canada as climate changes and as the temperatures warm. But our loblolly is loving it. It is going to be found much more widely. So which one of these organisms do you think is going to be a more generalized species, have a wider fundamental niche to start with? Loblolly. Why is that? Yeah, this is a pretty geographically diverse area. You've got mountains, you have Florida, which is just swampy mush, right? You've got all kinds of different geographic ranges that this loblolly is surviving in and doing pretty well in, it looks like. Whereas the red pine was already fairly limited in its range, and as that change continues, it's probably not going to do as well. All right, so change is a normal part of life on Earth. All of these environmental changes have been happening for thousands and thousands and millions and billions of years. If these environmental conditions change, species have a couple of options. They can adapt, they can move, or they can die. Those are their three choices. Sometimes they don't really get a choice, but those are the three potential outcomes for a species. And I think there's a dog hair in my mask and it's driving me crazy. Yes, there is. Excuse me. Okay. This kind of change is constant on Earth. 99% of species that have ever lived on Earth are extinct, which makes sense because Earth today looks very different than Earth did 4.6 billion years ago when it formed, right? So as these environmental conditions change, your organisms that can live there also change. Reasons for species to go extinct. It's possible that moving isn't really an option because there's nowhere close enough to move to. It's possible that they have a good place, but things like invasive species or other organisms in that ecosystem are more suited to those conditions and are better competitors. They might have faster reproductive rates or be more tolerant of a wider range of conditions and food sources and things like that. They're just going to outcompete. And then if environmental change is too fast, there's no time for that population to evolve and it will just go extinct. So if your options are move, adapt, or die, if you can't move, if you are in the same place but something else competes with you, or if you can't adapt, then you're gonna die. This has happened 5 times in Earth's past in very large degrees. And so these are the 5 previous major extinction events, mass extinction events. You'll notice that there are 6 here. We are currently in the 6th mass extinction on Earth. What are some of these extinction events? Which ones are you familiar with? You might not know which one is which, but there's one that's pretty famous.
The Cretaceous one.
The Cretaceous one, what happened then?
That's the dinosaurs.
That's the dinosaurs, yeah. So when the dinosaurs died out, that was the most recent before our current mass extinction, and that was when the dinosaurs were wiped out with a meteor striking the Yucatan Peninsula area and life on Earth changing pretty dramatically. Potentially some other stuff too. geologists are not 100% sure of exactly what happened. Which one has been the most extreme, the worst extinction event in terms of the biodiversity loss? The Permian, that one was pretty extreme. 95% of current or existing species at that time went extinct.
Do you even know what happened in that one?
That's a great question. We don't.
Okay.
It's possible that there was a meteor, it's possible that there was climate change or volcanic eruptions, but we don't know exactly what caused it, and it was the worst one. So you'd think that we could figure something out, but because it was so bad, it wiped out 90% of marine species. So there's something that was affecting the oceans, and it also wiped out 70% of land vertebrates. Most species at that time were marine, which is why you have that really high level of extinction. The first one was the late Ordovician. That one was due to climate change. Sea level dropped when glaciers formed, which allowed a lot of land for organisms to colonize and live in. But then as those melted, you had a dramatic change in the landscape of Earth. You actually lost a lot of marine species. As your glaciers melt, you have much fresher water. Those conditions of the water are going to change and not be the ones that they had originally adapted to. Late Devonian, we can see on here these dips on our graph. Those are the major extinction events. So there have been some minor ones where you do see a dip in the species or the genera, I should say, the number of genera on Earth. But the major ones are where you see these dramatic dips. So this one right here, that one is the Permian, the really extreme one where you go from here to here. But similarly, we have the Cretaceous, which was the dinosaurs dying out, and you still have a pretty dramatic dip. What's happening to biodiversity over time on Earth as a general trend?
Yeah, it's
Increasing, yeah. So if 50% of the organisms that are alive today died off, then you are losing a lot more diverse life than, say, this dip right here, just in terms of sheer numbers of different types of species. When we look at geologic history and we look at these mass extinctions, we're not even talking about the number of species, they're talking about the genuses or the genera. So why would they look instead of species at the level above that in terms of taxonomy? Why would we go more general? How do they know what organisms were alive, first of all? Fossils, right? So why, looking at fossils, would you look at genuses instead of species? You're looking at this.
Right, hard to tell.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell. A lot of species look pretty similar when they're in the same genus. And so some of those characteristics that would normally show the distinction between these species, like color and slight morphology changes, those get lost over millions of years. So they just generalize it a little bit more. All right, and like I said, we are currently in the 6th mass extinction. So we know what caused some of the previous ones in geologic history, but we definitely know what's causing this one right now. So we are in the middle of the 6th mass extinction. Although extinction is normal, although environmental change is normal, the levels that we see right now are not. We are seeing a background rate of extinction that, or the background rate should be about 1 to 5 species a year, and we're seeing about 1,000 times that. So we are losing a lot of species at a rate that's much quicker than normal natural processes. And they predict that as many as 30 to 50% of all species, all of those approximate 10 million species, are possibly heading towards extinction by the mid-21st century. So what's causing this? Humans. What kind of things could humans do that are causing this? We talked about a couple already. Habitat destruction is a big one. So habitat destruction is one of the most prevalent causes of these extinction events. When organisms don't have a place to live anymore, then they're going to die off. So habitat destruction, they just don't have that niche anymore. Overharvesting is really important, both on land and in the ocean. Introductions of invasive species, climate change. Emerging diseases is a big one that we haven't really talked about. Why would emerging diseases be a human activity? The spread of them. Yeah, people are very mobile. We move around a lot. We also like to put things together in ways that they aren't always found in nature. So looking at like the coronavirus, for example, they think that it had something to do with a wet market in China where organisms were put in close contact and they were defecating and eating and dying and doing all of these things in close proximity, and organisms that wouldn't naturally be found in the same places in the wild. And so diseases can pass between these organisms in ways that aren't naturally found. And then all of these changes that humans are causing happen really quickly. We like to do things fast. We do artificial selection quicker than natural selection. We also do all of these extinction affecting events a lot faster than natural processes. Why does it matter that we're doing this quickly? Right. Populations can't evolve if it happens too quickly. So they can't adapt in time. On a normal extinction event in the past, recovery back to the previous level of biodiversity took about 10 million years. In the terms of geologic time, that's not really that long, since Earth has been around for billions of years. But in human terms, that is a very, very long time. It's about 500,000 human generations. And those extinction events were happening without the presence of humans in most cases. And so, or in all cases, I should say. So this recovery time might be very different if we're still in the picture. All right, some of our recently departed extinct animals from Earth, you can see up on the board. And so these are all examples of those human causes, all different human impacts that caused extinction. So we saw habitat destruction with the Pyrenean ibex. I guess it should be Pyrenean. That's the Pyrenees. Anyway, the ibex. Habitat destruction and hunting wiped that one out. It's got some pretty sweet horns. I think that's probably why they were hunted. France and Spain, I don't know that they would be eating a whole lot of those, but destroying the habitat was a really big one for them. Peruvian monk seals was another hunting example. Also habitat exclusion, not being able to get to the areas that they would normally be in their geographic range. The Baiji river dolphin, that one was pollution, which was one that we didn't talk too much about. Habitat destruction can include pollution as well, putting things in the environment that are not supposed to be there, that change your natural levels of nutrients and that change the chemistry. And then the Hawaiian crow had the introduced disease of avian malaria that wiped them out. So it only takes one thing to mess up your fundamental niche, one abiotic factor, and you can no longer survive. So if you mess up multiple abiotic factors, like the habitat destruction can cause and hunting can cause, you're going to have a very rapid extinction event. In terms of extinction, you're going to be more likely to go extinct if you don't have genetic diversity. If you're going to adapt, if you have the time to adapt as a population, you need the genetic diversity there in order to do that. Genetic diversity can be lost in natural processes as well as human impacted processes. So if you don't have that diversity, then you're going to have a hard time adapting as a population because of inbreeding depression. Organisms that have similar genotypes breed together and then they make offspring that are impaired. They don't survive very well. They don't have the ability to adapt and have these genetic differences to allow this population to be healthy and adaptable. That low diversity, like I said, can be natural. So cheetahs are an example of a natural loss of genetic diversity. About 10,000 years ago, they had a bottleneck effect. We don't really know exactly what it was, but for whatever reason, most of the cheetah population died off, and you have just a small group of individuals that continued on in the population. So only their genes are present. But you can also impact genetic diversity through human processes, like we saw in the Florida panther. They lost most of their population because of hunting and habitat destruction down in Florida. The Florida panther is an endangered species. It was really, really low in their population numbers. They were like 20 or so individuals in Florida, and then they introduced 8 related organisms from Texas, panthers from Texas, and just those 8 individuals, adding those to that population of 20, allowed them to get up to about 100 individuals. It let their population expand because of that added genetic diversity. We do this to crops especially. We have reduced genetic diversity in our crops and livestock, which is particularly dangerous in terms of environmental change and losing these organisms. Why is that particularly dangerous if we lose our crops and livestock? Yeah, there's already issues with food production with our current population growth. If we don't have the food that we already have been successfully growing, then we're really going to have some problems. So just like in our wild populations, if you have lower genetic diversity, your organisms are going to have a lower chance of survival. Same thing with domesticated species like our livestock and our crops. So if you don't have genetic diversity, you're more likely to die off with environmental change. The reason that we have especially low genetic diversity in our crops and livestock is because of artificial selection and because of our focus on the specific types of foods and animals that we like to eat. This has been happening fairly recently. So in Europe, 50% of livestock breeds that existed in 1900 are now extinct. They stopped cultivating them. They stopped carrying those organisms at their farm because why would you when you have this better producing cow, this more meaty chicken? So focusing on the breeds that are most productive leads to the extinction of the ones that are less productive. Similarly, in North America, of the 200 breeds of domesticated animals, about 80% are declining or facing extinction. We see this in animals, we also see this in plants. Bananas are a monoculture. If you've ever had a banana flavored candy, it tastes nothing like bananas, right? That is because artificial banana flavoring came from a previous variety of bananas that is no longer existing. It is an extinct species of banana. But they used to taste like that, apparently, which I don't think was a great loss in terms of flavors. But current bananas, it is a monoculture. And if you have an issue with that one species, then all your bananas are gone. In the 20th century, at the beginning, we had about 8,000 varieties of apples that farmers were growing, and now it's only about 100. Some of those 100 are pretty great. Honeycrisps, love them. But we lost a lot of genetic diversity in our apple population. In order to counteract that, people save seeds. So there are more than 14,000 seed storage facilities around the world trying to preserve this crop biodiversity and make sure that we don't fall into this problem if environmental change happens and we don't have any food to eat anymore. What kind of societal changes would cause this kind of thing to become even more pronounced? Like, what's been happening over the last 100 years to our agriculture that have caused a decrease in biodiversity?
The use of technology.
Okay, so use of technology, we can make the same thing over and over and over again. We can reproduce our results and do it quickly in a large scale. Yeah, what else? What does the farming industry look like today as opposed to 100 years ago?
Bigger farms.
Yeah, more large corporate farms rather than smaller individual farmers. A lot more industry-based farming rather than traditional farming methods. Also, changes in pesticides and all kinds of pest management strategies as well have led to trying to specialize on breeds that are resistant to crop rots and to insects and things like that. All right, so when we're looking at a species, we can try to figure out what's the risk level for this species. Is this something we need to be concerned about? Is this something that will probably be okay? How many do we have? So you can put them into these categories. One is data deficient. We haven't done enough studying of them in order to figure out what category they fall into. You can be extinct, where you existed as recently as 1500, but you no longer exist today. Threatened, where you're pretty close to extinction. Near threatened, where you're probably going to become threatened. And least concern. So these are going, starting at extinct from the lowest number of population or individuals in a population to the highest, or ones that we really need to focus on now, otherwise we're not going to have them anymore, to they're probably going to be okay. So we have that estimated 10 million species on Earth, but we've only assessed about 50,000 of them, which, to be fair, is a pretty good number of species. But of those 50,000 that have been assessed, it doesn't look great. Nearly a third of them have been classified as threatened with extinction. And when we look at the types of organisms that are threatened, which group of organisms do we see that is at greatest threat? Amphibians. What is it about amphibians that make them more likely to become threatened? Physiologically speaking. What are amphibians, first of all? Frogs, toads, salamanders. What are the characteristics of these amphibians?
Water and land.
Water and land.
Yeah.
So they have to deal with both.
Yeah, so they live on both water and land. So if part of their life cycle gets messed with, whether that's in water or on land, they're in trouble. When they are in the water especially, they're susceptible to pollutants and things like fungi because their skin is permeable. And so they are in very close proximity with everything that's in the water, and their skin has to remain kind of wet as well. And so just in terms of where they live, their habitat, their life history, as well as their physiology and what they interact with in the environment, they have a hard time adapting. They feel pressures a lot higher than some other organisms. So we can use them as what's called sentinel species, ones where if you start to see an issue with amphibians, you're gonna have problems with other organisms later on because they're sort of the first warning sign, the canary in a coal mine kind of. All right, so like I said, when you are faced with extinction, when you have these selective pressures, things that are stressing your species, you as an organism, things like climate change or introducing a new species, you have those three options: adapt, move, or die. If you want the best chance at success, you should have a wide geographic distribution so that if part of your habitat gets messed up, it's okay, you still have a lot of land area to colonize and to live in. If you have specialization to a habitat or food supply, something that nobody else is competing with you with, like say you really like this bitter tasting plant, but everybody else can't eat it, then that's probably going to be good for your survival rate, that nobody's competing with you. Genetic variation in the gene pool, you have to have that genetic variation in order for your species to adapt. And then reproductive rate relative to the rate of environmental change. What do you want to see in your reproductive rate in order to be able to adapt? Do you want a fast reproductive rate or a slow reproductive rate? Fast. Why would you want a fast reproductive rate? You're right, but why?
It gives like greater chance, right?
Yeah, greater chance at genetic mix-up, greater chance at just survival in general. If you are like, well, that baby didn't make it, but I'm having another one real quick here. So more chances at survival, more genetic diversity, more genetic like recombination that's happening, all of those things. So organisms are vulnerable at different levels depending on their life history, depending on their characteristics. So if you have a change in abiotic factors, if it happens rapidly, highly adapted species are likely to survive or adapt or speciate, have another species form as this environmental change happens. And that's because they have wide distribution, they have large populations with a lot of genetic variation. Typically these species are small as well, and they have high biotic potential. They can have a lot of offspring, short generation times, and ability to migrate. You can move, you can adapt. So both of those options are on the table rather than having to pick one or the other, as this organism has many avenues to survival. On the other hand, more vulnerable species have the opposite side of characteristics. They aren't distributed very widely. You only find them in this specific small area. They have small populations with limited genetic variation. Typically, these organisms are going to be larger. They have low biotic potential, small numbers of offspring, take a long time to grow those offspring and have babies, and they have a harder time migrating. So when we think back to our community ecology unit, when we had the R and K selected species, which ones are more vulnerable to extinction? K selected. K selected is the ones that are selected by their carrying capacity. Those are the big ones, like our elephants or whales. Our selected species, their population size is selected for by their reproductive rate. So they have lots of babies, they're smaller. All right, so our larger K selected species are more vulnerable to extinction than our R selected, our small ones, our fast reproducers. All right, so looking at a panda and a mouse, which one of these has a better chance of survival? Mouse. Pandas, while completely adorable, are a ridiculous organism in terms of adaptations. They are not very well suited to wide environments, and they are not very good at reproducing as well. So pandas, they need a lot of help in order to keep their population alive. Whereas mice, they are super adaptable. They are generalist species that aren't specialized to one specific habitat, one specific food source. Pandas, if bamboo goes away, pandas go away.
Are pandas endangered?
Yes. Yeah. Pandas are not doing so hot. Even in zoos, they have a really hard time getting them to reproduce. They're not doing so hot. All right, in the US, we have done an analysis of our organisms, our species here. And from what we can tell, about 2/3 of them seem to be secure or are secure. We have quite a few vulnerable, some critically imperiled, some imperiled, and some that are presumed or possibly extinct. So we have some work to do. We have quite a few species that need help here. Like we said, those rates of extinction are going up very rapidly. This graph is kind of hard to read, but this was the distant past in our fossil record. We saw a decent number of extinctions in marine mammals, but this background rate of extinction was pretty low. Our current extinction rates are up to 1,000 times higher than we used to see in our fossil record. But in the future, we think that it's going to increase even more than that, possibly 10 times more than our current rate. So extinction rates are increasing. We also have more species, but this is per 1,000 species per millennium. This is already adjusted for that change as well in number of species. All right, so if we lose these species, if we see all of these extinctions, our ecosystems also are going to be in trouble. We will have global declines in ecosystem function because we determine how an ecosystem functions based on the species that live within it. If we look at our marsh here, if you lose the grass, the marsh doesn't exist in the same way anymore. Those ecosystem services, like filtering water, like holding floodwaters, like being a nursery, those can't happen if specific species go extinct. And we rely on these services. Because we rely on them, we have assessed them. Back in our first unit, in our intro, we talked a little bit about the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, but that was looking at all of these different ecosystems and trying to figure out how are they doing? What is their current state? And of the 24 that they studied, 15 of them were in decline. So things don't look great. Because things are not looking good, there have been efforts by people to counteract these changes, this extinction that is happening. In 1900, they established the Lacey Act, where they protected against the killing and interstate shipping of illegally harvested plants and animals. And they expanded that with the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. That was one that was on your legislation quiz that you had a while ago. So these are ones, Lacey Act, I don't think they have on their list of things you need to know anymore, but CITES and the Endangered Species Act, definitely you should be very familiar with. Lacey Act was one of those first environmental legislations trying to counteract any kind of illegal trade. But then CITES expanded that to international trade. You're not just looking at interstates, we're looking at across the world, which makes sense because when you compare 1900 to 1973, people were traveling across countries a lot more than in 1973 than they were in 1900. So it was something that we needed to be more concerned with. And then also in 1973, in a flood of environmental legislations that was happening in the 70s, we also had the Endangered Species Act that listed critical habitats, that listed organisms that are classified as endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then in addition to that, it didn't just say, oh, this thing is endangered, it also put recovery plans in place to help these organisms recover. So one of the success stories of the Endangered Species Act is bald eagles. Their population was down to I want to say 200-ish eagles in the United States, and now they are found in 49 out of 50 states. They are a great success of the Endangered Species Act. You'll see if you look at lists of endangered species, states can have their own endangered species lists as well as the federal list. So in South Carolina, for example, eagles are still classified as threatened or endangered, whereas in the federal list, it's no longer on the endangered species list. All right, I'm skipping over that one. So in South Carolina, we have several endangered species. We have the right whale, red cockaded woodpecker, loggerhead sea turtle, Atlantic halibut, which I never realized could get that big. It is absolutely massive. Wood storks, diamondback terrapins, Florida manatees, and you guys are going to get the opportunity to learn more about these with a small project that you're going to start later today. So in addition to those previous legislations that were passed in the United States, there have also been international efforts to study biodiversity and to hopefully conserve it as well. And so in 1992, there was an international treaty that was formed with the Convention on Biological Diversity. So they had three main objectives: conserve biodiversity, use it sustainably, and equitably share the profits of biodiversity. So if something is discovered in the coral reefs in Central America by a drug company that's going to be the next cancer research drug that solves everything, it's important that everybody that is involved with that gets an equitable share of things. And so they put together a strategic plan to achieve reduction in the loss of biodiversity. In 2002, they put this plan into place. They decided that we had these areas to focus on. We're going to focus on those, and assessed it 8 years later. But things did not look good. After 8 years, in 2010, when they looked back, they saw that all of the trends that they were looking at, species at risk of extinction, had moved closer to extinction. Quarter of all plant species are still threatened. Natural habitats are becoming smaller and more fragmented. Genetic diversity is declining. We're still losing ecosystem function. The causes of all of these changes have stayed the same or gotten worse, and we have increased our ecological footprint. So every metric that they were looking at over these 8 years was going the wrong direction. Not so great. And the things that were threatening it are those human population factors that we talked about. So if we look at the population of humans and we look at the number of extinctions, we can see a pretty direct correlation here. As human populations increase, so have extinctions. So we are the cause of the 6th mass extinction. We can see this in our forests. So just like at the beginning, we were looking at our diversity of vascular plants and seeing these hotspot areas that are supporting this dramatic level of diversity. These areas are decreasing. It's hard to see on the light colored ones, but they are also decreasing. Our temperate and boreal forests, the range is being reduced. Our tropical forests are also being reduced. So things are not looking great. The reason for this is the land domestication that's happening. As our population expands, we need places to put all of these people. We need resources to feed all of these people. And so we see a pretty dramatic overlap in terms of our forests and our domesticated lands. And there's all of these infiltrations that are happening where forested regions in the past are being domesticated. In Asia especially, we can see domesticated land. If we look back at our forested region, a lot of that used to be forested and is now domesticated. When we use this land, when we domesticate the land, we also tend to not just destroy habitats, but to fragment habitats. If we think back to our population unit, if a population becomes fragmented and organisms are flowing back and forth between those, what do we call that? Starts with an M. Metapopulation. So fragmentation leads to a lot of metapopulations. We can still have some genetic diversity, some flow of genes between these. And we try to do things like this. They actually, I was just reading Land Bridge News. Hang on. They just opened up a bridge. I don't know, I'll have to find it when you guys are working on your project. Trying to connect to habitats that had been fragmented. You have this road running between this forested area, and they're like, well, we'll connect those with this little bridge. Problem is, organisms aren't great at finding crosswalks at all times. So even if you put that there, there's no guarantee that they're actually going to use it. And the amount of land that is fragmented compared to the area that they have to cross over is pretty small. And so we've done this with logging, we do it with roads, we do it with agricultural areas. And if we think back to those species distribution changes, if we put barriers in place that keep species from moving, it can lead to higher levels of extinction for our organisms. Because then they can only adapt or die. We'll take out the move option. One of the particular areas of concern is with our wetlands. Wetlands are extremely important, whether they're freshwater wetlands or marshes like we have here on the coast. And we're seeing a reduction in overall wetland area, which is important because they're a nutrient sink. They hold all of the carbon and nitrogen, and they purify water, they're filters. They have extreme biodiversity because they're really productive areas. And they are natural flood control and water storage. So these are areas that are important, not just to biodiversity, but to human life around them as well. Estuaries are my favorite example of these on our coast here. Our salt marshes are an estuary where the rivers are draining into the ocean. And they're incredibly important nurseries for a lot of organisms, especially our commercial fisheries, things that are important, not just for intrinsic value and inherent value, but also for monetary value. And so we're seeing a change in our estuaries. We're seeing a change in sedimentation of what's actually being brought to our estuaries and seeing a lot of pollution being brought there, which changes our productivity levels in estuaries. Who is that? Hang on, sorry. I've lost my mind. Hang on. iPhone. Okay. Hello?
Hello?
Is that Hogan?
What? Sorry?
It's not your class yet, Hogan.
Oh, sorry.
All right. See you later. Okay. Freshman. All right. So our estuaries are changing. We're seeing a lot of pollution, which is a problem. We're also seeing a lot of change and a lot of extinction in coral reefs. We're seeing coral reefs that are getting bleached. We have a lot of concern about this because in our marine environments, they're one of the most diverse ecosystems, our most diverse biomes. They are pretty picky. They have their symbiotic algae, their zooxanthellae, and if their abiotic factors, their abiotic conditions change just slightly in terms of temperature or pH or sedimentation, then they're going to expel those symbiotic algae and they die as a result. That is when you have coral bleaching. When they put out that algae, they expel it. And so if our coral dies, what happens to the rest of our coral reef ecosystem? Everything else dies. They're the bottom rung of our trophic level, right? So if we don't have our primary producers, then nothing else is able to survive there either. One of the other big threats is exotic species. So exotic species, as opposed to endemic species are ones that are only found in this one place. They're specific to one unique location. Exotic species are alien species, species that are from somewhere else that have been introduced. Exotic does not necessarily mean a bad thing. It just means they're not originally from there. They're not native to there. When it becomes a problem is when they become invasive. So invasive species are when you have this exotic species and they are taking over. They are well adapted to a wide variety of locations, a wide variety of conditions. And so they take over, they start to outcompete the native flora and fauna. So we have things like purple loosestrife, which is an issue in our estuaries, or in our wetlands, I should say. They're like freshwater. They will outcompete native grasses and cause a change in your local ecosystem, and not a whole lot can eat them. They don't taste very good. And then we have our brown tree snake, which was in Guam. It was introduced. They only have one other snake species, which is also an exotic species on Guam. And so all of the natural, the endemic species, the birds and the lizards are not adapted to having this venomous snake around. And so they have almost completely wiped out all of the native bird species and lizard species in Guam. They're all over the place. They're not really a threat to humans unless you're like a baby. Their venom is not very extreme, but they are a very big threat if you're a bird or a lizard. And so we also have the other threats as well, overharvesting, pollution, climate change. We do a lot of things to increase our extinction rates as humans. So how do we fix this? Thinking back to our very beginning, looking at those biodiversity hotspots. Compared to the overall size of Earth and the land area on Earth, these biodiversity hotspots are only 1.4% of Earth's area. But if we focused on those, if we preserve those, we can save 44% of known species in terms of plants, our endemic plant species, and 35% of all endemic vertebrates that we know. So focusing on these hotspots and focusing our management efforts and our protection efforts on these, we can get a lot of bang for your buck, so to say. And then this number, in terms of species that are being saved, is much higher when you take all of the other organisms into account, like our microbes and invertebrates. And we are seeing more protection of our land areas. So over time, we have dramatically increased the amount of protected land that falls within all of these different areas. You can have managed resource areas that are specifically not for like a national park or something, but we want this because of its resources, like our marine protected areas, things like that. Nature reserve, national parks, species management areas, protected landscapes, and managed resource areas. So we are trying to do things. It is not a completely lost cause. It was a pretty depressing set of notes of talking about all of the ways humans are terrible, but we are actively trying to counteract this and make positive changes. All right. Like I said before, you are going to have an opportunity to learn about some of our endangered species. You're also going to have the opportunity to learn about some of our invasive species that are causing these species to become endangered. So on the week at a glance, there is a link to this endangered and invasive species project sheet. I'm going to pass this out to people in person and then I'll explain. All right. So, let me turn on the light here. What you're going to be doing is researching one of these species. There's a list of endangered species, there's a list of invasive species. You're going to pick one. I'm going to call numbers and tell you who goes when, and we'll have a random draft pick, basically. So there's going to be one person per organism. If you pick an endangered species, you're going to research the things under the endangered species. If you pick an invasive species, you're going to research the things under the invasive species. With that information, you're going to make one Google slide, just one. You can change the size of your slide to make it like a 8.5 by 11 if you choose to, but you really only need to make one slide and describe all of those background information pieces. On the back, you have a rubric for your slide as well as for the presentation that you guys are going to be giving. So you're going to give a 2 to 4 minute presentation on Tuesday on your organism for the class and tell us all about your endangered or invasive species. So this project is going to be worth 30 points. The unit 4 assessment that you just did was 50 points. So it's somewhere between, it's like a quiz grade-ish. All right.
Is this our like semester project?
No, this is like a 2-day project.
Oh.
This is a very small project. All right, I'm gonna stop recording. Can't see anything. I don't know, we'll get there later, never mind. Okay, I'm gonna call your names and then pick which organism you would like. So first off, we have William.
Can I do the lionfish?
You got it. All right. Next, we have, and you can go ahead and get started once you have your organism. Number 12, we got Maggie.
Am I taking off of this sheet?
Yes. All right, Florida manatee. So it's going to be one person per animal. So I'll let you know if somebody else already picked it. Caroline.
The Chinese salad.
All right. Yes. Nicole.
Can I have the loggerhead turtle?
Michael.
I have the African honeybee.
Yes. Africanized honeybee. Emmett. You're muted. You're muted.
Stork.
Wood stork. All right. Lee.
The right whale.
Right whale.
What did Emmett choose?
Emmett chose the wood stork. All right, Sarah Burns.
Could I have the diamondback terrapin, please?
Yes. James.
I did the
Florida panther. Donovan.
I picked lion.
Goliath grouper. Charlotte. APES have the loggerhead turtle. Nicole already got the loggerhead, sorry. We got woodpecker, halibut, moth, kudzu, or adelgid, which is like a bug.
I'll do the kudzu.
All right. Zoe.
I'll do the woodpecker.
Zoe's got woodpecker. Ellie. Halibut, gypsy moth, or adelgid. Halibut, the Atlantic halibut, the European gypsy moth, or the hemlock woolly adelgid. All right, Ellie's got the halibut, and last but not least, Matthew, what would you like?
The European gypsy moth.
You got it. Yes.
So good.
All right. So you guys are going to be giving this presentation on Tuesday. There is a Dropbox for your slides, so I can pull them up for you to do your presentation. So make sure that that is turned in before class on Tuesday. Once he gets back from the bathroom. Now I have to find my stop recording button.